This is Dave Monkey, Prairie Monk, WEFT, Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. Today is Sunday, February the 16th, 2020, and this is the Prairie Monk program, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways, conservation, and education, and the environment, and everything else that Dave has been up to lately. In fact, I think it has to do with pictures today.
This is interesting today. I'm going to deal with panoramas. Panoramas are is a common term, but it's in building circles. It's a building that's in the round, 360 degrees, and artists direct their attention to the 360-degree field that you're looking at. The audience gets to occupy a platform in the middle. So this last week I got a call from a friend at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, and she wanted me to go to a lecture at the Crown Art Museum that would be about panoramas. And the woman giving the lecture would be Sarah Velas. It was interesting, the rain and snow and temperature down. I couldn't get my key into my car, so I had to take a bus and walk some. And streets aren't always plowed, so that was a little challenge. But I was very glad to be at that meeting. Sarah was wanting to point out the history of this. She had stumbled over a strange-looking building that was circular in a decrepit situation in Los Angeles. And she got to find out that it was a panorama. These were interesting in the era when you didn't have cinema and you didn't have other ways of communicating. This goes back to the 17th century. If people went to war, the soldiers came back and they could tell people what the situation was like. It could be a very direct panorama, or it could have information there too, to show specific vehicles or situations. So it was not necessarily a straight panorama. The Asians tended to use this more than anyone else, and they still do. But some of this moved into other countries. The Silk Road that ran across to Turkey brought some of this to Turkey, the Middle East, and Eastern European places. Britain had patented one of these buildings in 1776 or something like that. You have to think back to that time, and people were astute enough to be able to do that sort of thing with their legal details. The one use of this is to just do a panorama of your city, and it's interesting to have a panorama of the city as it was in 1800s, and then have a look at it today with the same sort of panorama. Sarah Vallis got interested in this. The building she discovered got torn down for development, but she discovered a silent film era palace that was closed and could be adapted for this sort of thing and for the history associated with it, and the room to have a panorama built. She's in charge of this. She is the expert, and it has taken off. She's had grant money from various agencies and has traveled worldwide to check these facilities out. Sometimes they're only half the 360. At Atlanta, they have a panorama like this of Civil War activities, but it's a half panorama in terms of the building. But the same style. The modern version can have projections onto the panorama, and you can have sound. But early on, you would not have had sound unless somebody spoke it. The war theme is one of the themes, but it's just interesting to see how people communicated before there was cinema and other media. But it hasn't lost out altogether. It's an interesting alternative to art interpretation, and with the aid of computers, you can project onto a panorama a lot of information. Yeah. Sarah herself was using 375 slides in a 1-hour presentation. And that was very helpful because you could see a panorama from one era and the same panorama from a different era. You could make comparisons. So the computer era allows us to do that. We're not exactly at that stage yet. We have to present visuals linearly, so we have to say this is the one, and then you have to see the other. So there are some advantages to doing this, and frankly, some of these scenes are almost minimal in their expression. And, the buildings have quite a deal of character. You have to have a central platform. You have to have the panorama a certain distance away. It could be 60 feet or it could be 30 feet, depending on the room that you have. To get to that central place, you have to have an access walkway that goes underneath the panorama so you can get into it, and then up onto a platform so that you can then see and look around. So modern panoramas can actually have an elevator for you to move on, and Sarah was saying to some extent she thought that was rather too modern, but then she got to find out that some of these modern additions are quite healthy and has changed their style. She's been, there's a town in California that has a Chinese name, and she has been working with these people. They have in their hometown in China, they have a panorama, and they have reproduced that so that the town in California can have that same panorama. It's a lot of this is culturally friendly. It's communication. It's a way of people getting together when they had no other facilities, and it changes, however. So if you have a dynasty, as China did have dynasties, they sort of closed out in the early 1900s. Then there would be a change in philosophy. If you go to a republic and then you go to communism, you're going to have a different change in this sort of panorama. The introduction of railroads changed things. So the panoramas are expressive of what was happening. The railroads went into Manchuria. They got big in China, but they also, the U.S. employed at very low salaries for Chinese people to put in railroads, which made it possible for railroads to go across the country. So you do have Chinese communities that also have these sorts of resources and interests. I was tempted to wonder the next step for Velas was to go to Kansas City. And Kansas City took some of the World Fair materials and relocated them. So you have that sort of interpretation in Kansas City, and so Sarah will go there and check that out, and then she will go back to Chicago, and she'll meet up with Lisa Stone, who called me or emailed me, and Lisa is in charge of found objects, art that's alternative, secret societies, and early history of groups like the Modern Woodsman or the Elks, and so these topics are related. I was tempted to wonder if Chicago might be, the School of the Art Institute might be interested in encouraging the creation of a panorama in Chicago. Kind of different, and I also thought that that could happen in Champaign too. So you would. My thoughts turned to what you might do in Champaign. We are going through some changes. It's not dynasty changes, but it's changes. We have had an era when everyone, all the businesses went to the malls, and now the population that goes to the malls has dropped off, and big boxes are left empty in the malls, and the towns that were dead central business districts for many years are beginning to be gentrified or redeveloped. So the area that is around Weft and Heartland Pathways next door is now in a tax increment financing district. That means that the tax that is paid to the county is for 25 years returned to this area for development in this area. There has to be some scrutiny to that. School districts still have to receive money, and other agencies too. So it's not a total tax increments, but it's an attempt to to revitalize an area, and that includes the history. So you see a building across the way has become a bar. We've lost the Pocket Prairie, but it's all a part of development. The News Gazette building has been sold, and the PNC Bank has been sold, and suddenly our assessed value of buildings has gone up considerably. At one stage when the Grubb family was engravers were closing out, I could have bought 2 of these storefronts for $45,000. Now our assessment is $300,000, and that means that you may have to pay as much as $6,000 on taxes, and you, as a non-profit agency, you might not be able to do that. WEF's building, fortunately, is they're lucky to have it on a tax exemption, so that survives. At the same time, many of these buildings have character. This was a railroad town. The railroad came through Champaign, a few miles west of Urbana, and you're not always totally sure why, but it may be due to the moranic geology. It may be due to some people being more powerful than others and suggesting that the railroad did not go through Urbana. You have to understand that the railroad came through on a somewhat diagonal. So we have flatiron buildings where the Jeffersonian north, south, east, west plat meets with the diagonal plat where Illinois Central was given a certain amount of territory to put in a railroad. They could create towns, and they so you get used to flatiron buildings. The city building is a flatiron building. And the little park outside of this square tavern is a little triangle that is a result of the 2 plats coming together. So the buildings have various ages. Some are quite old. Older buildings were frame buildings, and when you heat a frame building in winter, they get very tender and can get caught on fire. So the buildings that Weft and Heartland Pathways are in are part of 8 buildings by 100 feet, probably about more than 25 feet wide, because they had invented I-beams that could support that sort of distance, whereas wooden beams would not do that. So 8 buildings facing Market Street, then 8 buildings facing Walnut Street with 40-foot alleyway in between. Those buildings are all brick, which means that they're much more fireproof. This was a railroad town. People came to town with their horses and put the horses in a livery stable and put their harnesses in a harness factory just up the road. So there were gaming houses, there were coffee shops as a front, there were vaudeville theaters and brothels, and this corridor has character that is part of Champaign. we're thinking, the city is thinking, and Grundolution and others are thinking of $250 million project to have an auditorium that will accept big venues. And this is profitable to cities, and you have to know that Champaign is more a commercial town than Banner is. So they're two different towns, but they also work together. We have to figure out if you're going to put a hockey team in here, a national level hockey team, which is the concept, then you're going to extend the MTD building, which the buses are doing well. You're going to leave the Inman Hotel there, but now all the buildings between University Avenue and Springfield, one city block, empty. And the rumor is that probably this $250 million event will happen. If that happens, our assessments will go up again. So in that framework, how do you keep the media people, the art people, the character of the street? Fortunately, the city is interested in that character, and so they've saved the soul of the cattle bank. And up the road, we've lost an elevator that was there. The railroad was on nearer to Weft, and it was later put on the other side of. Well, the railroad line was a little to the east, and a new building was built there that was a 1923 building that replaced an earlier building which was pulled up the landscape on rollers and whatever you could do. It was steam engines and whatever. So it's located, and it's now the Black Dog Saloon, and is actively used. So we're thinking, how do you ask the planners for $250 million? Where is their visual, their radio, their how do they incorporate the things that interest us a lot in terms of interpretation and wonder about what your history and culture was? If you go north of town a little bit, there's a very long warehouse where trains would come in and unload their materials, and horses and carts would line up on the other side of the warehouse and sort out what they needed to take. The building is still there. It's very big. It's you can't really think about something like an art city in that location without being afraid of the heating bill in wintertime for artists. Vaulted ceilings. So how could you remodel these places so that they could be interesting? There's a railroad access to the main line, or has been. It can be reinstated. We would hope to bring in recreational steam from the Monticello Railroad Museum, so we're working on that. There's the possibility of something akin to, but different from the panorama concept in amongst this, to give character, to know where people put their gardens, and where different ethnic groups were located, And how did people travel? The building across the road, just 2 or 3 doors from here, was mainly established to prevent theft of materials just left on the railroad. So part of that section of the reason we're talking about was bars and what have you, but it was in the 1920s it was taken over for lawyers' offices. So the Lincoln Building is a 4 or 5 story building that was designed for legal people. Legal people have moved out some to other places of a different style, and or nearer to the county seat, which is in Urbana, and that's left space for artists. But now that involves parking, and so do you want to have people come in by bus? Do you have a parking garage so people can still drive in? So when you're talking about media and its survival in downtown Champaign, you have very modern computer gaming facilities with 100 people doing gaming work. You have artists that can only barely survive if you do something like put parking on till 9 o'clock at night, and you build a very big parking garage. Then there's some debate about whether we should walk or drive to the downtown. Many attempts have been made to close off a street so that that would encourage people to stop. But closing off Neal Street for a number of years meant that traffic had to go around in a curious way, and so the main drag off of 74 was not a through event anymore. And the streets are a little bit narrow, so I want to encourage you to think about what you would do with your media when there are many different variables involved. And different communities. Urbana is a very different community than Champaign. There have been a number of attempts to get them to join together, but it's not going to happen. And so how do we combine with programs like the Boneyard? And do we have art in the park? Do we have juried art? Where would you put the juried art if you have a venue that is got a place big enough to have juried art coming in from a national level? I just want you to be aware that this is happening, and if we don't speak up for media and art and culture, then the people who come, if you're going to have a big media, there's going to be wives, there's going to be friends and relatives, there's going to be all sorts of people who are interested in poking around in your territory. So what do they find? Is it more than restaurants? Is it more than office space? If you need to buy a screwdriver, is there a hardware store? So planning is very important. So I give a lot of credit to the planners who have to figure out how to work with this. They have decided in the 20s, they decided to put underpasses under the railroad line because there was so many cars and trucks that had to wait for 26 trains a day to go past. And so planners had to decide that. You had to go from muddy streets with broad walks that just had wood placed down. Sometimes it was corduroy, where you put the wood across the road, enough to stop a dray or a bullock wagon from sinking into the mud. It gradually improves. Some of it we've pulled down. One Flatiron building on Neal Street, near where David works, with the Orpheum Theatre, was a Flatiron building that had a lot of character. Banner had a Flatiron building, caught a fire. And they tried recently to buy the plot back, and perhaps I think they were dreaming that they might recreate that sort of building. But that didn't happen. This has always involved a lot of politics. We have at the end of the street here a Royer building that was the headquarters for the Illinois Traction Company and Illinois Power. So you used to be able to pay your bill just at the end of the street across University Avenue. I think that building will remain, but so then you have to think, what happens on the other side of the railroad line? That hasn't been subject to a lot of things at the moment, but there's a big dig to stop the water from flowing into places like Green Street. And our little Pocket Prairie has gone over there. But the whole purpose of it is to store water when it's raging with a 5-inch downpour, and it let it out slowly so you don't have to row a boat in Green Street. So we have to give credit to people for thinking about this. We have to think about the people who do the work. And strangely, we're faced with a challenge that many of the things we do require people who have pretty good knowledge about things. Weft, for instance, has to have a tower. The existing tower has feet that have rotted, and they have to have a new tower. And really there's only 3 or 5 people at Weft who are expert in working with that. Some of them come in from out of Weft. Bill Taylor comes in. The difficulty is there are a lot of people who are willing to help, but we have people who need do-it jobs, and unfortunately we don't have a lot of do-it jobs. So you have to think about park districts and forest preserves and the like, and how do they use their volunteers, and how do they encourage some of those volunteers to go to the next level so they think and dream. And some of the dreams have to be big ones. People don't think they have that sort of capacity, but when faced with it, they can do it. And so we need some volunteers that are going to be able to think about it. Wolfram has been here recently, and he has a home base in Champaign. And one of the things he has to do is to encourage people who are in the basement with computers but don't quite know where they want to go. They don't want to do curriculum type things that are very formal. They are independent as all get out. And how do you encourage those people to make the move to where they could possibly contribute significantly to the world's development and maintenance and sustainability? The educators are concerned with children who often get some education but then don't get jobs. We export those jobs to other countries where the material or the equipment or what have you can be made at a lower figure. We also have a population problem. We have just too many humans. It's patently obvious we don't have the facility, and as those humans demand more space, so we lose all our hummingbirds and creatures that we never will have again, but they've taken millions of years to evolve. So if you have fewer people, you then have a gross national product which doesn't grow. So, okay, that's the name of the game, is to do interesting things rather than to perpetuate the growth of humans. And then there's a style of human. Do you have a tax-based culture, or do you concern yourself with the quality of life? The business acumen of doing well and then donating some to a local cause is okay, but we need the government to be able to do more than just have a few generous people work with this. How do we create jobs for those people? So when you start looking at whether we can put a media facility in, incorporate it into a venue, when it's used for hockey, it's for hockey, but it can be used for other national type meetings. Will there be hotels around enough that the hotels are almost on the site of the hockey arena? So where do you think you want to have your media, and how do you want to encourage it? How do you work with groups like Parkland College and the university to encourage the sort of thing that Wolfram talks about, is that he has mathematics, and he teaches people how to understand the language of mathematics enough that they can then use algorithms and but not necessarily understand it all. And we need the same with schools, with agriculture. We have a rural setting, and it's out there, and it's a little lonely, and it's sometimes a little druggy. And how do we work with that community and grow it in a modest way without looking for a huge gross national product? So that's sort of my Champagne world. But I go over to Urbana, and there is a Lincoln Square Mall, which was the first indoor mall in the United States, and it has a Jumas hotel right alongside it. And the Jumas Hotel was there while there was still a Broadway and a Greenway Street, and there hadn't been a takeover for the mall. But I go there and I find people walking. I find people playing guitar. I find the co-op there, but it's too small. It's too small for modern day malls. but it has character. And so I started to look around, and I find that it's an era of 50 years. We go through these syndromes where you have World War I, World War II. In between there, you had an era of not much money, and then you have World War II, and then you have after World War II, and then in the early 60s you had groups get together and do things, whether they were the Isaac Walton League or the Audubon or a whole bunch of others. And in the co-op there's a very nice exhibit by potters, and it's hard to relate to this with verbal commentary. So I will try to give you an idea of what is here. The potters have been in existence for 50 years. They have moved around from place to place. I think they started out in an old school. They have been in the Park District. They've been in various buildings, and they've had a society where you get clay and you fire clay. And you can't exactly do this at home. You don't have a kiln. So these people who've been members over the years have had joint facilities where they pay enough for the rent of the building and the rent of the firing devices, and of the potter's wheels where you're making pots. And so they've gotten together. Many of the people who've been there years ago when it started in about 1968 or that general era, and they've done a bang-up job of creating a display that is good for you guys. So I walked in, and the first thing I did was to look at the diatribe that told the story. But then there are very interesting pieces of pottery. One of the first is a daffodil made in ceramics, and it's quite a character. There are teapots, there are birds, there are dishes that you look into and there's crystal inside. There's a very organized pottery. There's raku, which means that it's sort of rough and tough. You get a cracking, and it's done on purpose. You have people who do things that are oriented to Indian activities. There's a theme of people. There's a theme of almost fabric. There's a theme of turtles on the lid of a pot. There's just a. I encourage you to go look at that exhibit, and we may, if we get the chance, do a blog with this so that it might go up on Urbana Public Television, just to let people know. But it is very time-consuming to do a blog like this and to have it meaningful. So take your feet and go down to the mall and enjoy the mall. At the moment, and I'm not quite sure whether it's still in action after today, there is a camera exhibit, a camera club exhibit, again, 50 years. And it is wonderful to see how many people can be drawn in from 19 counties, and just to assess the cost of the frames that these pictures are exhibited on. Is somebody had to think about that, improve it over the years, and facilitate your looking at this exhibit that comes from young children as young as 4 to people who are club members, to people who are youths or architects or people with a different background. Just up the road is a fabric store that's been there for 16 years, and it's closing out in retirement. But that has been part of the atmosphere of this small mall. The Common Ground Food Co-op is there, and it has seats out in the corridor, and people are very friendly, and they have an art gallery and a place for teaching people how to cook, and people get there. I bought some hummus, and I sat down to eat there, and people were having a riot that didn't know each other but got to talk to each other. Just that's the sort of atmosphere. We've lost the gymnasium. And the gymnasium, I often wonder if we couldn't have had some gymnasium there that had dynamos and that the people who were exercising would create electricity. It's not ever going to happen if the activity is international or national. It's got to be something that comes from a free-flowing idea at the community level, like an indoor farmer's market. Or, so is Jumer Hotel, which has had its problems surviving. And now maybe it will be a boutique. I think one of the major chains is going to occupy it. But again, it will take a lot of pizzazz to put it together. But it's a little better to leave it there than to say, this is too small, we'll take it out and do something better. That's a tendency which sometimes is a little frightening. So that's how we lose some of our establishment buildings, and in Europe it would be different. Sometimes you would be sleeping in a cold stone building that's been there since the 16th century. There's a need for character. There's an MTD building. There's in downtown Champaign, but it's also got roots in Urbana, and it occupies what used to be a roundhouse. That's where its headquarters are, on University Avenue. And so how do we get people from the Kickapoo Trail through through from the MTD building through the sanitary treatment plant, across the boneyard, across to going around Busey Woods and across to Champaign. All these things are interactive. Sometimes in the past, even curriculum have been very pure, and we need that for specialists. But we also need generalists who get involved with the politics and involved with trying to upgrade the community. Let me see what the time is.
7 minutes.
7 minutes. Yeah. some of this goes far beyond the local. We've been looking at Monticello area, where you have railroads that coalesced, and rich soils and farmland, and an existing city square, and families like the Piatt family that gave the name to the Piatt County itself, industries that come in, and sometimes you can have an industry that has left for China or some other place and left a big empty building. Monticello had a Pepsin factory that took 250 people regularly, and it had grown from being nothing to Dr. Colwell discovering Pepsin, and that being a digestive thing. So it was popular. It got to go to a Piatt house. Then it got built around so that you had an E with on a slight hill. It was 5 stories on one side, 3 stories on the other side, and in the middle was the leg of the E that had railroad access. We've been talking about Ys that allow trains to change directions or go in different directions, or get access to the world at large, because there's a Norfolk Southern line that goes through Monticello and it's active. And so if you're a railroad museum and you want to work with an engine from Indianapolis, then that engine can come in by formal rail. You can have a rather wonderful Monticello Railroad Museum, which is at its starts with one car on Neal Street up by the post office, and gradually they bought some of the interurban, and then the main line closed out, so they bought the main line, and they run interesting experiences for people who've never ridden on a rail. And there are people there who are very aware that we have a railroad challenge. If you go to Chicago, you're often going to be shunted off on the edge because a freight train that's worth millions of dollars needs to go through. And so the restoration of that corridor with 2 rails rather than 1 is helpful. So we've been looking at the Monticello area across to Clinton, and you have to explain to people that there's an economic value to this. Tourists just love to come and bicycle or car and find out what is your specialty, what do you do, who are you, how do we communicate with you, do you have a festival, do you have a calyx barn dance? What's going on here? People have the time and the interest to do this. So we have a possibility of a hike and bike trail from Rantoul to Paxton. How do we activate that? So we need some of you out there to be interested enough to do more than just volunteer. We need volunteers with some expertise. We need volunteers who can work with people who have expertise. The tower that goes up for WEFT will have to go up on a certain day with a certain crane rented in from St. Louis. We'll have to have people who know what they are doing. But then there are the people who can do a backup when air conditioner has to be changed. Then there'll be someone who has the muscle to go change the air conditioner. And that can be done with a person who doesn't necessarily have radio broadcast expertise. And in the long run, you can find jobs for people who may not even have a high school degree. It's hard to create jobs, especially if we send them overseas. So the world is in a slight confusion at the moment because climate change is here. And when you take into account all the variables that I've been talking about, add climate change, and it's going to be very awkward. Do you have communities that can flex to meet climate change? Some of it may be very global, but some of it may be produced by humans. And can we economize on those situations? So the same goes for animals. Will they be able to adapt? And how can we help them adapt? And how can we retain some of our unique ecosystem? This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. Thanks for listening.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed here are solely those of the speakers and no one else.